I'm here today with Paul Pastor. Paul is a writer and editor living in Oregon. His writings on spirituality and culture blend a love of the Christian scriptures with wide-ranging interest in literature, ecology, philosophy, and art, and a unique intimacy with the natural world. Paul's writing is widely recognized for its beauty and depth and has won numerous awards, including from the Maggie Awards, the Evangelical Press Association, and the Christian Book Association. After earning his MA in Biblical and Theological Studies from Western Seminary, Paul gained a strong reputation as an expert freelance book editor and co-writer, including for his work with international evangelist Luis Palau, for his award-winning spiritual memoir, Palau, A Life on Fire. In 2019, Paul joined the editorial team of Penguin Random House, acquiring new books for the Waterbrook and Multnomah imprints. As well, he serves as editor-at-large for Outreach Magazine. His new book, a book of poems releasing this month, is titled Bower Lodge. So, Paul, welcome today, and thanks so much for joining us.
Absolutely. It's great to be here and get the chance to talk about Bower Lodge.
Yes, absolutely. So before we get into that, though, please tell us a little bit more about your background. You've got, obviously, some very interesting stops along the way.
Yeah, for sure. My background, well, I'm an Oregon kid, grew up in rural Oregon, very much kind of a country kid, but books were always a very important part of my life. Was blessed to have parents who believed really strongly in the power of literature and in the power of reading the right books. And so some of my earliest memories are coming home with laundry baskets full of library books and devouring that. And just because of some of the stranger aspects of my growing up, which is a long story we'll save, a lot of my education and personal formation came as a result of reading a lot of books. So even though I never really saw myself as a young man doing the type of work I do today, it completely makes sense in hindsight because it was a bookish life from the beginning. For a long time, though, I was thinking that perhaps, moving towards the academy or moving towards some sort of biblical studies role was going to be for me. So with that in mind, I spent about 7 years in higher theological education, culminating with, as you mentioned, a degree from Western Seminary, essentially just in the biblical languages in Hebrew and Greek. And it was during that time that I realized, my creative passions are actually much stronger than my academic passions. I don't just want to go talk about dusty old books. I want to make some fresh new books. And as a result, some divine providence and possibly some luck in there, I got some opportunities coming straight out of seminary. One of the key ones was with Christianity Today. I began an editorial residency with one of their magazines, and that quickly bloomed into an associate editor position that I held for just under 4 years. And then after that, branched out into kind of my own work. And I found very quickly that I deeply enjoyed the chance to work with people on their words and on their ideas. And the editorial role, when it's at its best, is really a bit pastoral. It's a bit creative. It's a bit of that academic skepticism and insight that had attracted and appealed to me, paired with the ability to be creative and to say, how are we going to publish something that can help change the world a little bit and really represent this author's voice well. And then along the way, I write, constantly writing, obsessively writing. Someone recently asked me how I find the time to do everything. And, it really, my work life often feels a bit like a quilt. Like my own personal writing is large pieces of things, large projects, but they're formed from really small scraps of time, scraps of thought that over the course of a day or a week might occasionally feel a bit discouraging, although I am blessed from time to time to be able to take focused time for that writing. But over the course of years, those small scraps can be put together into something that with care and with some insight and with some patience can end up really beautifully. So that's a little bit about me. I presently live out in the Columbia River Gorge in a little ghost town of about 70 people. My wife and my 3 kids and I have lived here for about the past 8 years. We're blessed to be here, living in the woods, making books, and just generally trying to put useful and beautiful things into the world.
Wonderful. Well, you are. Um, Before we get into your books, though, let's talk a little bit about Waterbrook Multnomah and what your role is there, the different types of things that you're working on.
Sure, absolutely. My role is as an editor there. So Penguin Random House is the largest publisher of books in the world. We have a really rich book culture. PRH sees itself as a steward of really a lot of what was the best about, especially 20th century publishing culture, really rich publishing culture, and then is committed to moving that into the 21st century. Waterbrook and Multnomah are the two imprints that I am blessed to serve. I'm one of just a few editors who acquire for those imprints. And then every press does this differently. Every publisher does this a little differently, but we are sort of a boutique publishing model. And what that means is our authors, we're very selective, so we take on fewer books than many of my peers or many of our peers in especially the Christian book industry would do. And for each of those books, we have a really high level of degree of care. And then I walk each of those projects from acquisition, so from the negotiation with the agent, from purchasing that title, through the developmental process, through the line editing process, all the way up until it's ready to be handed into copy editing. So I don't do any of that nitty-gritty punctuation stuff, although of course, a little cleanup happens along the way. But I am blessed to work from the very first conversations with the author through putting the big pieces of their idea in place, all the way down to how do we make the individual paragraphs and sentences flow beautifully here. And that really is a good fit for me because my interests are both global. Like I want to say yes to the right project. I want to be able to develop that project, kick the big tires on it so that it works, that the arguments are sound, so that we have maximized each idea to its full potential. But then I'm a musician with words. And I love the rhythm and the musicality of language on the page. And so the opportunity to work with each individual author to bring their voice to the forefront, all the way down to the line editing, is really special for me. And so it's great to have that commitment and that support from the press to go all the way from acquisition through the line editing of a book. And that's fairly rare these days. It's fairly rare.
So I know you only started there in 2019, but are there some books that have been released already that you've worked on that you can talk about?
Yeah, many. Let's see what people might recognize. One of the really big joys of my life is stewarding Eugene Peterson's legacy projects. So I am a portion of my work is dedicated to going through Eugene's archives, which Waterbrook holds a very significant portion of those. And then my mandate is to basically bring out faithful, beautiful, but very fresh projects from Eugene. So I've got a couple back on my shelf. One of them would be this Hallelujah Banquet, which comes from a sermon series that he preached during his time at Christ Our King Presbyterian Church. Another is a very short book that actually just came out in November called On Living Well. And it's like a gorgeous collection of shorter wisdom from Eugene. As well, his authorized biography, A Burning in My Bones from Win Collier, which has won numerous awards, and many people are familiar with that. I was the key editor on that. Rich Velotis is one of my authors. Sho Baraka is one of my authors. His book, He Saw That It Was Good, absolute must-read title that released in this past year. I have a really wonderful stable of authors that I'm privileged to work with, and it's a growing stable. But yeah, many of the projects I've worked at are released. Yeah.
Excellent. So let's talk about your own authored work.
Yeah.
Before we get into the new book, tell folks about some of the things you released previously.
Yeah. My first book came out in 2016. It's called The Face of the Deep, and it's a creative nonfiction exploration of the Holy Spirit. So there's 14 theological, but also very poetic essays that integrate personal narrative, that integrate kind of historic Orthodox theology and all this stuff to talk about the Holy Spirit in this very, the way I would describe it is this very roots up way, this very grounded, earthbound, I hope, beautiful way. So that received really some very kind critical acclaim and has developed I was going to call it a small cult following. It was re-released along with an audiobook and a new edition last year, right height of the pandemic. So yeah, that project is really a joy, and I'd recommend anybody check that out. Then as well, I've released 2 volumes of what will eventually be a 4-volume devotional series. It's called The Listening Day. And that is sort of Lectio Divina, so the historic spiritual discipline of divine reading, that brings a couple passages of the Bible together in conversation and then offers this imagined dialogue between me/the reader, the sort of the voice of the project, and the voice of God the Father. And that project has just gone so much farther than I ever could have imagined. It has really become a beloved part of many people's spiritual journeys. It's unique, it's a little strange, but it's really different. So initially I envisioned it, I was requested by the publisher to sort of practice something along these lines. It was just sort of a conversation that bloomed into what if you tried this, that bloomed into, oh, here we go. We're really doing this. This book is happening. But yeah, it's just a fascinating little project. So along the way, though, one of my first and central loves is creative writing. I certainly can do nonfiction work. I do a lot of nonfiction writing, essays and other short form writing, interviews and things like that. But my love is creative writing, and poetry has been this genre that I've always written ever since I was in high school, kind of the only thing I've always written. And barring any other kind of economic realities, it would form the core of my work. I have a very high view of it. I think you can do things with the genre and the medium of poetry that are very difficult or impossible to do by means of nonfiction or even by means of fiction. So I'm sort of captured by that personally, and so it's a pleasure to sort of bring us up to the modern moment here, and the release of my first collection of poetry titled Bower Lodge.
Yeah, so eclectic and creative set of things that you've done, which is really impressive. And they're beautiful. I know the things that you've written before, and all the Eugene Peterson work was just, wonderful. So congratulations on all of those things. And as you kind of alluded to, economically, poetry typically is not one of the blockbuster bestseller financial income revenue models for authors or publishers. But you've gone anyway, right? It sounds like it's a real passion for you. I mean, talk a little bit about, kind of the book itself, and then maybe we can get into a little bit about the kind of publishing decision process that you went through for it.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yeah, the economics are funny when you look at it from a strictly financial point of view. But one thing I often coach writers and try to remind myself of is that there's often a great work that each of us are called to do. And sometimes, as good as it may be, sometimes some of the lesser works, the lesser projects, even though they can keep the lights on, sometimes they pull against or even can distract from that great work. And so there's this balancing act, right? We need to live, we need to keep the lights on. But then if we do that to the degree that we are neglecting some of the more soulful aspects of what we might be called to write, economics aside, then that in itself is a failure. So each person and each writer needs to find that balance for themselves. There's not a right or a wrong way to do it. I truly believe that. But you need to sort of feel your way forward. So for me, yeah, economics doesn't pay that well, and that's okay, because the satisfaction is fairly high when it's something that you really feel a sense of creative calling and a sense of creative drive to do. The project, Bower Lodge. So this collects short poetry that I wrote over roughly the past 10 years, but with a significant emphasis on poems written between 2017 and sort of the very early parts of 2019. And I found myself during those years in particular, kind of thrown into this what St. John of the Cross might call a dark night of the soul. And it felt like the significant portions of not just my life, but the significant portions of myself, like my internal reality, were being systematically, lovingly, beautifully, but terrifyingly taken apart, gently set to the side, and put back together again. And I don't know if you've ever experienced a time in life like this, but it was one of those kind of, the Celts would talk about thin places in terms of geography. Like there are some parts of the world where the spirit world and our world really overlap in a way where they just sort of get mixed up. And it's wonderful to think of that in terms of geography. We've probably all experienced what it's like to be in one of those thin places, and where you just, walk into this space and it's beautiful. And it's like, wow, this is a numinous, incredible place. But I think that time also holds those thin places. And there are certain moments in your life where you enter this different sort of melding of reality, and something is happening in the soul and in the spirit. And it's often hard to describe that, but when we experience those things, I think we're faced with a choice. We can either lean into that, and it's typically fairly uncomfortable, or we can lean away from that. So Bower Lodge is full of that soulful, spirit-filled, I hope, imagery that came from that time through dreams and sort of through active imagination and all of these different things. So the poems in the collection are themed. They have a movement. There are 3 basic sections to the book that will walk you through this very, very subtle story. But of course, each piece of the work stands on its own as well. So yeah, I think it's interesting. We've gotten incredible early support from some of just my favorite poets in the world: Shan Furch, Marla Yeomans, John Blaze, just some brilliant, brilliant endorsers and supporters of the project. And it's been a real satisfaction to see it release into the world and begin speaking to other people as well. But yeah, that's a little bit about the structure of the collection and a little bit about its story.
Wow. So you, of anyone, knows how much editors are typically looking for a book proposal to talk about who the target audience is for a book. And I can see where for your typical nonfiction or other genres of book, that's maybe a little bit easier to put your hands on than a book of poetry. Is that true, or am I missing something there?
Yeah, it's interesting because 100 years ago, even maybe a little more than 100 years ago, poetry was really the popular medium. Was really, I mean, think of Alfred Lord Tennyson, or think of Yeats or Frost. Like there are these massive cultural poets, and we get a little hint of that today in, say, a Mary Oliver, perhaps, where she has some cultural weight and it feels like she was the voice of a moment. However, much of our popular poetry has gone into songwriting, right? So that's sort of the songs of the people. But I do think that we've lost, unfairly lost, an excitement for and a language for and an appreciation for the popular beauty of poetry. Worldwide and historically, poetry was the voice of the people. It's where folk songs come from. It's where all of these really incredible cultural touch points come from. And we've just sort of felt that it's an academic, erudite, maybe sort of, maybe it's the milk of literature, like just sort of like, oh, just everyone's got a little bit around somewhere, but no one really likes it. I actually think it's not milk, it's whiskey. It's deep. It should be deeply distilled. It should be fine. It should have terroir. It should go to your head just a little bit. It should be sipped, and really really restoring that art form is part of the work of the poet today. So to answer your audience question there, a lot of people, unfortunately, need to be reminded or convinced that poetry is for them. It really is. When it's done well, it's fun, it's interesting, it's delightful, it sticks with you, it's image-based, it's extremely visual, typically far more visual even than fiction. It's short, it can fit into multiple parts of your day, and it is a unique way that literature can go with you every day and be your companion. So as I thought about this, and I thought about, the realities that you're mentioning, which are absolutely true. A lot of people put out little books of poetry that are great, perhaps, and the work perhaps is great, but they simply never find their audience. There were a few different, for lack of a better word, a few different handles that I wanted to put on this book so that somebody who might be the type of person that you're describing might not have a bookshelf filled with poetry books. They might just not feel like it's for them, not be willing to spend $18 on a book of some stranger's poetry, which is totally understandable. I often wouldn't do that either. I tried to give some handles, and one of them is visual. Each of my books has visuals in it. The Face of the Deep and The Listening Day as well has original art with each of it. But the art of this is really important. So as you go through, you'll see that there are these multiple illustrations that the publisher actually decided to print in color that are arising directly from the imagery and from the story of what's happening in the book. And they're the result of a really fascinating collaboration with a local artist, Jacob Cowden, who's a friend. He and I were working on this book and collaborating on this book in the early stages, and he began to do these haunting, beautiful, sort of mysterious, dreamlike images. So he produced these images with, by digital means to begin with. And then he and I actually have one of them here. He and I, you can see the scale of this and the size of this. This is the eye moth, which eventually shows up on the cover. He and I projected these images onto 2-foot lino blocks, and by hand, with very sharp tools, we carved those into the lino over the course of many evenings. Some good beverages, some vinyl playing on the record player, and we spent that time to really tie together the visual art of the book and the image of the book. Then as well, we decided to take some of that art and even go to the point of making these small little enamel pins
That's cool.
as a pre-order bonus. And part of that was just to celebrate it, to celebrate the icon, to celebrate the image. But we also very much wanted people to have something that they could touch, that they could hold, that took this somewhat ethereal thing that might not feel like it's for everybody, poetry, and really tie it to their life, really tie it to something they could get excited about. And I think it's working. We've seen an incredible response so far. Sales have far exceeded my publisher's expectations. Pre-order sales have far exceeded the expectations. I've received several messages from people who are saying, I've never bought a poetry book before, but I'm so excited to read this. And so part of that work, which is to evangelize for the genre I've written in, feels like it's being successful. So my hope is that even if someone feels that poetry might not be a genre that they would have ever sought out, that they're so compelled by something about what they see here or what they might experience here, they decide to try it. They decide to step out and try something new.
Well, good for you, for, being so conscious about that aspect of it. I think that's really wise and admirable. There are a number of folks that I typically work with within the Writing for Your Life, spectrum that are interested in publishing poetry, but have a really difficult time finding a publisher for that. Mm-hmm. Who published your book, and how did you go about that process? Finding it?
Yeah, Fernwood Press. They're a nonprofit Quaker press based in Newburgh, Oregon. I like to keep things as local as I can. And I had really admired one of their poets, Shelby Stevenson, who was the previous poet laureate of, I believe, South Carolina. I forget which Carolina. I believe it's South Carolina. And Shelby had written this gorgeous book called Shelby's Lady. And it was all about, it sounds really odd, but the beauties of hog butchering. And so he has this lyrical, gorgeous elevation of the pig as an animal, and he takes an entire collection leaning into the beauties of this traditional Carolina hog butchering. And I was so taken by it that I just felt like this was going to be a good home. So I did have multiple offers from publishers for this book. I had reached out. I was fairly selective, but Fernwood felt like it was going to be the right home for it. You know, it is hard. I mean, publishing in general is hard, but the good news about that is there are more options today than ever before, and especially since the economics of it are a little difficult to begin with. Poets are faced with several good options ultimately if they're just willing to release certain expectations. One would be self-publishing. Many poets find that that actually is a workable thing. You can bring some expert perhaps some editorial help on and to make the project the best that you can be and move it forward. But then there's also this really rich culture of small presses, people who love what they're doing, who are good at it, who have a path. Fernwood would be one of those. And I really often am pleased by the level of quality that comes out of that. And I say that as an employee of the largest publisher of books in the English-speaking world. So there's no replacement for perhaps the reach and the energy of a large publisher. But for a passion project like this, there are so many different good options. And
that's really good to hear.
It felt like mine.
Good. Well, as I said, a lot of folks, have found that path to be a little bit frustrating. So I'm glad to hear that you're a proponent and a participant in that direction.
Yeah.
So for a person like me who, has an engineering background and a business background, and poetry isn't typically at the top of my most wanted list for new books, do you want to read something that you think might appeal to, a Neanderthal like me?
Not a Neanderthal at all. Yeah, I would love to read something. This is a poem from the beginning of the collection, and it's really speaking to a core theme of it, which is we often try to protect ourselves from pain in this life, but by doing so, as many people have observed, we're protecting ourselves from what is most useful, most unique, and most beautiful about ourselves. So this uses the image of feet and of walking to think a little bit about that. It's called Leatherfoot. Leatherfoot. Two options. One, to go always in shoes, buying and buying them, wearing and wearing them out, hurting less, knowing less, being shod, nor can foot feel, or be your own shoon, so to say. I mean, let callus pack and marble lushly, brown with your color and the earth's, go on gravels or on carpets just so, nervy, curling, cold some, split some, whorled and knotted, but with 10 toes feeling, leaving prints no other leaves, unsafe, unnumb.
Very cool. Well, maybe I'll have to reorganize my priority list a little bit and read more of your book. So as you just demonstrated, the actual auditory aspect of reading, right? Spoken word, poetry, et cetera, is really powerful. So do you have an audio book of this?
I will. Yes, I will. I don't yet. It's going to be a bit of a project, but I am planning eventually to release that. So yeah, keep your eyes peeled on that for the future.
Good. Yeah. Well, please let us know. We'll, help get the word out about that as well. But I'm glad to hear that. I mean, I think it's, again, from a layperson's perspective, an important element. So
I agree.
And obviously you read very well. So, and particularly, something that you wrote yourself like that, right? So
there's a lot of satisfaction in being able to bring that music forward.
Yeah. So looking forward, since you are so creative, you've got so many irons in the fire, I can guess. Is there anything in the future that you're able to talk about yet or not?
Yeah, well, you'll see a lot more from me, God willing. Yeah, I try to hold all my expectations with a fairly open hand, but I am working on a nonfiction project I'm very excited about. And then I'm working on several other creative projects. I'm working on several long-form poetry projects that blend narrative and blend sort of my unique style with a poetic bent. So this is obviously a collection of short poetry. They're short individual poems that have a larger theme, that have a larger story. But I'm working on two projects that are significant years-long projects, the type of thing you invest 5, 6+ years in to compose. And both of those feel like they are like they're just really important. So you'll see likely a selection of those types of things coming forward that will bend genres a little bit and hopefully be very entertaining, but also, I don't know, kind of elevate what in the past was seen as fairly normal, where writers like Dante and others would bring these sort of spiritual journeys into poetry, but there was a story. It was a story-focused poem. So you'll see some of that from me, God willing.
Good, good. Well, we'll be looking forward to that, as well as your work at Penguin Random House.
Absolutely. There's a lot coming down the pike there that you'll see. Much more from Eugene Peterson, new work from Rich Velotis, and many others.
Good, good. Well, please keep us posted.
Yes, I will.
And let people know what your domain name is for your website.
Yeah, you bet. You can find me at pauljpastor.com. My last name is Pastor, just like the church minister. And that's the best way. I'm not very active on social media, but you will find me on Twitter at pauljpastor. So that's the best way to connect if you are a social media person.
Wonderful. Well, Paul, congratulations again on all your amazing work, and thank you for sharing it with us today.
Brian, thank you. It's truly a joy.